Some floods rise slowly, others arrive like walls of destruction, erasing entire cities in minutes. From tsunamis taller than buildings to flash floods powerful enough to move houses like toys, these are the most powerful floods nature has ever created. Welcome to Terronix. If you enjoy extreme nature content like this, consider subscribing and liking the video. Let's begin. One flood season in China may have killed more people than any natural disaster in recorded history. Entire cities disappeared beneath what looked like an endless inland ocean. Streets, farms, and villages were swallowed by muddy water that stretched for miles in every direction. After years of drought, massive snowfall, spring melting, and relentless summer storms overloaded multiple river systems across China in 1931. The Yangtze, Yellow River, and Huai River all burst beyond control. Water flooded major population centers and remained there for weeks. Estimates suggest anywhere from 850,000 to 4 million people died. But what makes this even more horrifying is that many victims didn't die in the flood itself. Disease and famine killed countless survivors afterward. It remains one of the deadliest disasters humanity has ever seen. The Yellow River earned the nickname China's Sorrow for a reason. In 1887, it became a death machine. Massive levees failed and unleashed a violent wave of brown water across flat farmland and villages. Entire communities were buried under thick layers of mud. Days of heavy rain pushed the river past its limits, but the real problem was years of sediment buildup that raised the river above the surrounding land. Once the levee broke, gravity did the rest. Water exploded outward across northern China. Between 900,000 and 2 million people are believed to have died, and for many survivors, starvation became just as deadly as the flood itself. This flood crossed an entire ocean and still killed people thousands of miles away. In 2004, beachgoers in Indonesia watched the ocean suddenly disappear. The shoreline pulled back, exposing the seafloor. Then it came back as a massive wall of destruction. A 9.1 earthquake beneath the ocean floor near Indonesia violently lifted the seabed and displaced unimaginable amounts of water. Tsunami waves shot across the Indian Ocean in every direction. In some areas, waves reached over 160 feet tall. Entire towns in Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India were destroyed. The waves even reached Africa hours later. More than 225,000 people were killed. It remains the deadliest tsunami ever recorded. Entire villages were erased in a single night. In 1970, the Bhola cyclone slammed into what is now Bangladesh and created one of the deadliest storm surges in history. A massive wall of seawater rushed over low-lying islands while most people were asleep. Homes were ripped apart instantly, fishing villages vanished beneath dark water. The shallow coastline amplified the surge, helping it rise to nearly 35 feet. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people were killed. Some islands were almost completely wiped off the map, and the disaster became so devastating that it helped trigger major political upheaval in the region. Japan built massive seawalls to stop tsunamis. It still wasn't enough. In 2011, people watched black water carrying cars, ships, and burning debris tear through entire cities. Airports became rivers, highways disappeared, neighborhoods were flattened. A powerful 9.0 earthquake struck off Japan's coast and triggered a tsunami that arrived in less than 30 minutes. Some waves rose over 130 feet high. More than 18,000 people were killed or went missing, but the disaster didn't stop there. Floodwater triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster, creating one of the worst technological crises in modern history. Even one of the most prepared nations on Earth couldn't stop this flood. A perfectly timed high tide turned this storm into a nightmare. In 1876, a massive cyclone slammed into Bangladesh and created a storm surge that became one of the deadliest floods ever recorded. During the night, huge walls of seawater rushed through the Meghna estuary and flooded miles of flat farmland and villages. People had almost nowhere to run because the land sat barely above sea level. The timing made everything worse. The cyclone struck during high tide, helping push water nearly 40 feet inland. Around 200,000 people were killed, and for many survivors, the flood was only the beginning, because disease and starvation spread in the aftermath. This flood stretched nearly the entire length of a country. In 2010, Pakistan was hit by monsoon rains so extreme that the disaster kept moving for weeks. Flash floods tore through mountain regions first, destroying bridges and entire villages. Then the floodwater moved south and transformed huge sections of the country into massive inland lakes. Entire highways disappeared, crops were destroyed, millions were stranded. Nearly 20% of Pakistan was affected. More than 20 million people were impacted. Even NASA satellites captured how enormous the flooding became. It looked less like a river flood and more like a country slowly sinking underwater. Cyclone Nargis turned Myanmar into a graveyard of destroyed villages. When the storm made landfall in 2008, massive waves of seawater pushed deep into the Irrawaddy Delta. Entire farming communities were flattened, boats were thrown onto land, buildings were ripped apart. Salt water flooded huge areas of farmland, winds reached over 120 miles per hour, but the storm surge caused the worst destruction. Water pushed nearly 25 miles inland in some areas. Around 138,000 people were killed, and rescue efforts were slowed because the government initially blocked outside aid, making the disaster even worse. At one point, the Mississippi River looked more like an ocean. In 1927, relentless rainfall pushed America's most famous river beyond its limits. Massive levees failed and sent floodwater racing across towns, farms, and railroads throughout the southern United States. Entire communities were stranded on rooftops, farmland disappeared beneath endless brown water. Over 23,000 square miles were flooded, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. The disaster permanently changed flood control in America and triggered major migration across the country. For months, the water simply refused to leave. Imagine looking at satellite images and seeing nearly a third of your country underwater. That happened in Pakistan in 2022. Extreme monsoon rains created one of the largest modern floods ever recorded. Entire towns became islands, roads vanished beneath giant inland lakes. Millions of homes were damaged or destroyed. In some regions, the water stayed for months because there was nowhere for it to drain. Over 33 million people were affected and nearly 8 million were displaced. The scale looked almost unreal from space. It was one of the clearest examples of how climate-driven extreme weather can overwhelm entire nations. Even after all of that, some floods were even faster. China spent decades trying to control its rivers. Then, in 1998, nature reminded everyone who was really in charge. Weeks of relentless rain caused the Yangtze River and surrounding waterways to rise to dangerous levels. Entire cities watched water creep closer as soldiers desperately reinforced levees with sandbags. Then the defenses started failing. Huge sections of farmland disappeared underwater. Entire neighborhoods were flooded. More than 3,600 people were killed and millions were displaced. For months, huge sections of China looked like endless lakes. The disaster forced the country to completely rethink how it manages flood zones. People in the Netherlands went to sleep thinking it was a normal winter night. Many never woke up. In 1953, a powerful North Sea storm pushed massive waves toward the coasts of the Netherlands, England, and Belgium. Then high tide made everything worse. Dikes failed in the middle of the night, sending freezing seawater rushing into towns and farmland. Families climbed onto rooftops as entire villages vanished below dark water. Over 1,800 people died in the Netherlands alone. The disaster became the reason one of the greatest flood defense systems in the world was eventually built. One of the loudest explosions in human history also created a deadly flood. In 1883, the eruption of Krakatoa was so powerful it was heard thousands of miles away. But the explosion wasn't the only killer. Parts of the volcano collapsed into the ocean, launching massive tsunamis across Indonesia. Huge waves slammed into coastal towns with almost no warning. Entire settlements were wiped out. Ships were thrown inland. More than 36,000 people were killed. The eruption darkened skies around the planet, but the tsunami was what caused most of the death. A city built barely above sea level never stood a chance. In 1900, Galveston, Texas was hit by one of the deadliest disasters in American history. A powerful hurricane pushed a massive storm surge directly into the city. Homes were ripped from their foundations and smashed into each other. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to piles of debris. The surge reached around 15 feet high, which was enough to cover most of the island. More than 8,000 people were killed. Afterward, the city literally razed parts of its land to prevent it from happening again. This flood didn't destroy everything quickly. It destroyed everything slowly. In 2011, massive rainfall overwhelmed Thailand for months. Industrial parks, neighborhoods, highways, and farmland slowly disappeared beneath rising water. Entire factories shut down. Cars sat underwater for weeks. Millions of people were affected. More than 680 people died. The damage reached far beyond Thailand because major electronics and car manufacturers were forced to shut down production. A slow-moving flood ended up disrupting global supply chains across the world, and the floods ahead became even more violent. In 2021, parts of Europe received nearly 2 months of rain in less than 2 days. What started as heavy rainfall quickly turned into violent flash floods across Germany and Belgium. Narrow valleys became deadly traps as rivers exploded over their banks. Entire homes were ripped apart and swept downstream. Roads collapsed, bridges vanished, cars piled up like toys. More than 200 people were killed, and thousands of buildings were destroyed. The scariest part was how fast it happened. In many towns, people had only minutes to react. Imagine standing in a mountain valley and hearing a roar getting louder every second. In 2013, that became reality in northern India. Extreme rainfall triggered devastating floods across Uttarakhand. Massive torrents of water mixed with mud, trees, and giant boulders rushed through mountain towns and religious pilgrimage sites. Bridges snapped apart instantly. Entire buildings were ripped from their foundations. Thousands of people were killed. Some estimates put the death toll above 5,000. The force of the flood completely changed parts of the landscape. In Venezuela, entire towns were erased in a matter of hours. In 1999, relentless rainfall triggered thousands of landslides near the coast. Then the mountains began collapsing. Massive floods carrying mud, cars, trees, and boulders surged toward densely populated areas below. Entire neighborhoods were buried. Some communities were swept directly into the ocean. Death estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000 people. Even today, parts of the coastline were permanently reshaped by what happened. A single night changed millions of lives in Bangladesh. In 1991, a powerful cyclone pushed massive walls of seawater into densely populated coastal communities. Villages disappeared beneath dark floodwater. Families were swept away while they slept. The surge reached nearly 20 feet high in some areas and rushed far inland. Around 138,000 people were killed. More than 13 million people were affected. The disaster forced major changes to storm warning systems that still save lives today. Cyclone Idai left parts of Mozambique almost unrecognizable. In 2019, powerful winds, storm surge, and massive inland flooding destroyed huge sections of the city of Beira. Entire neighborhoods disappeared underwater, roads became rivers, crops were destroyed across multiple countries. Roughly 600 people were killed, but millions were affected across Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Aid workers described entire regions as disaster zones. From above, it looked like the ocean had swallow the land, and then nature started creating floods from collapsing mountains. A collapsing volcano created one of Japan's deadliest floods. In 1792, part of Mount Unzen suddenly gave way and crashed into the sea. The impact launched massive tsunami waves across nearby coastlines. Entire fishing villages were destroyed in minutes. Boats were thrown inland. Then the water bounced back across the bay and hit communities a second time. Around 15,000 people were killed. It remains Japan's deadliest volcanic disaster, and it all happened because an entire mountainside collapsed into the ocean. Engineers saw this disaster coming and still couldn't stop it. In 1818, a giant lake formed behind a wall of glacier ice in Switzerland. Officials tried drilling tunnels to slowly release the water before disaster struck. For a moment, it looked like it might work. Then the ice dam failed completely. Millions of cubic meters of water exploded through the valley below. Entire villages, farms, and bridges were destroyed. Around 40 people were killed. It became one of history's most famous glacial flood disasters. This may have been the most violent wave ever recorded. In 1958, a massive earthquake triggered a gigantic landslide in Alaska's Lituya Bay. Around 30 million cubic meters of rock crashed into the water below. The impact launched a megatsunami so powerful that water climbed 1,720 feet up the opposite mountainside. Trees were ripped clean off entire cliffs. Boats were thrown across the bay. Only a handful of people died, but the raw power of this event was almost impossible to comprehend. This flood happened before humans could even record it, and it may have been one of the largest in Earth's history. At the end of the last ice age, a massive ice dam holding back glacial Lake Missoula repeatedly failed. When it broke, water exploded across the Pacific Northwest at speeds reaching nearly 65 miles per hour. Entire landscapes were carved apart, giant canyons were created. The flood carried more water than all modern rivers combined. It permanently reshaped huge parts of North America. And then there was a flood so massive it may have changed Earth's climate. Lake Agassiz was once one of the largest lakes on the planet, stretching across parts of modern-day Canada and the United States. When portions of its natural ice barriers failed, unimaginable amounts of fresh water rushed into the oceans. Scientists believe some of these floods released water at rates equal to hundreds of Olympic swimming pools every second. The event may have disrupted ocean currents and triggered global cooling. It wasn't just powerful enough to destroy land. It may have altered the future of the planet itself. From tsunamis to glacial megafloods, these disasters remind us just how small we are when nature reaches its full power, and in many places around the world, the next major flood may only be a matter of time. Subscribe to Terronix for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.